Welcome to Gramercy Book Club, Patricia. We have had a robust conversation about Infinite Country and the voice you gave to all 5 family members as they struggle to keep themselves whole in the face of the hostile landscapes that threaten to drive them apart. So we're very excited for you to be joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you this evening. Thank you for choosing my book.
And just to remind everyone, Patricia, you've authored 3 novels, all highly lauded, recognized. The Veins of the Ocean, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris and Vita. You've received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and your stories have widely appeared. I believe the participants may be aware that you also teach creative writing at the University of Miami. Tonight's extraordinary moderator, who you'll now be talking with, Mónica Ayala-Martínez, she led our discussion earlier. She's a native of Colombia, was a philosophy and psychology professor there, and later came to the United States for her master's and PhD in Spanish. And she's the head of Latin concentration at Denison University. So I'm going to just let Mónica and you have your conversation. And again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Patricia, welcome and thank you again for joining us. We have a group of avid readers who have been sharing their experience and how touched they were in different ways after reading or during the reading of your book. I would like to, combine some of the questions I have after reading the novel. Well, I read the novel and now I've read the 4 novels that you've written. And also I will share with you the questions that our participants have for you. So the first one I see is a comment that says, I hope Patricia will discuss the mysticism inherent throughout the book.
Okay. Well, first, Monica, I'm very happy to meet you, and thank you for agreeing to be in conversation with me, and again for the invitation. With Infinite Country, yeah, there's this incorporation of, some people would call it mysticism, some people call it myth or folklore, and other people would call it traditional history or just ancestral knowledge, and take it as true as anything else that we are told is a part of our history. My mother's from Bogota. Monica, I don't know where you're from. Where are you from?
I'm from the Caribbean coast. I was born in Cartagena. Yeah.
Oh, Cartagena. Okay. I love Cartagena. So my mother's from Bogota, and all of my mother's family is still there. My father's from Medellin. I was raised with a lot of these stories from the Muisca civilization. The Muiscas, even though here in the United States we're more familiar with the Mayas and the Aztecs, the Muiscas were one of the 4 most advanced civilizations of the Americas. They were enormous population before they were largely massacred by the Spanish conquistadores. But some communities remain, but the history is integral to the landscape, the Bogota landscape, high in the Andes Mountains. All of this was Muisca territory. So in writing about the homeland of Elena and Mauro, and how it's leaving one's homeland is such a terrible loss, akin to a death and something that you mourn, I felt it's important to really go deeper into the stories of the land and all the peoples, including the ancestors, who are deeply connected to that land, as are the characters in the family of Infinite Country. There are stories that are not specific to Bogota, that are more, Monica, as you know, Colombia is a very diverse and vast country with very distinct regions. So there are a lot of stories that are specific to different regions. That also, surface in different ways in the novel. And that's always something that has interested me as well, how how different communities in different places have their own origin stories, or just the stories that they repeat in order to explain their connections to their land.
Thank you. I just would add to that, Patricia, that while reading them and seeing not just the presence of those stories we've woven into the novel, but also having the parents share them with the children, brought to me back that component of the orality of these stories that are passed down from generation through generation by listening to our parents and grandparents tell us those ancestral stories.
Yeah, I think Colombians are storytelling people, perhaps more than people from other places. But also storytelling becomes very important when you're a family in the process of emigrating. Very often your stories are the only thing that you take with you. And the stories are how, repeating them and sharing them and remembering them are how you remember who you used to be in the place where everybody knew you, in the place where all your ancestors lived. And that's how we come to understand ourselves. And each individual, each family, each community, each country even has the stories that they pass on and repeat. Sometimes, you know, we just call them history, but they are our stories, and they are the ways that we decide who we are and determine our identities.
So I have another question here that says, how did you achieve such authenticity within each character unique experience of migration?
Well, I I did a lot of work. I did, you know, this book went through a lot of work before it got to the form that readers have in their hands. But there's a lot of it comes from true life, people close to me, people I've known, stories I've heard, research, and then characters begin to take on a life of their own, and they start to establish their own voices. And before I sit down to write anything, I kind of spend a long time really dreaming about a book and trying to hear those voices and know the characters well enough to know the things that they would say, just knowing the things that they've been through, because of course the things that we say are largely determined by our psychology and our past experience. So the voice comes from crafting an entire life for each character, and that just takes a lot of time and imagination.
Yeah, I have to say that, you know, as a native of Colombia, I was in Bogota through your book, right? I was like, wow, you know, she knows La Candelaria. She really does. You know, she really knows how to get from this place to that one. And I really was amazed by the fact that, yeah, it was clear to me that it required a lot of research and a lot of, you know, traveling, knowing the place, reading about it, being there, seeing it. So it is clearly reflected, and is part of the effect on making it truthful to us as readers. That the fact that that place and the cartography of the place is so clearly defined, you know, everywhere they are, you know, that geography becomes so important in the story that it shows us how you have done a lot of work to know those places and recreate them that way in the novel. Okay, so as you have talked about all that work that you do to produce a novel, and not just research, but all that work of trying to listen to characters and imagine stories and imagine ways in which they are going to behave. I was also wondering if you would like to share with us some of the strategies that are part of that. You know, for example, the novel doesn't start neither at the beginning nor the end of the story. It has a particular moment, it has a young girl, a woman, an adolescent who is in a very, very tough situation in Colombia at that point. Then, you know, we go back, we go forth, we see her mother, we see her father, her grandmother. So could you share with us some of those strategies in deciding names, where to start, where to end, who becomes the narrator at some point, you know, who doesn't speak much, who speaks more, all those things?
Well, the short answer is it's a lot of experimentation. There's no formula, and that goes with anything that I'm writing. Sometimes I don't have any idea what I'm doing or how I'm going about it. In the case of Infinite Country, I had this image, this scene of an adolescent girl breaking out of, a facility for youth offenders. So I knew that that would be in there. And I also knew that it was the chronicle, the portrait of an entire family. So over the years, I started to think about, well, how am I going to accomplish these two things? So I knew that the character of Dalia, the youngest sister who's 15 years old, who you see in the first scene, that she was really very important in the story. She's sort of, the, not the anger, but she's sort of, the thing that everything orbits around. And she's more important to the story of this family than she even knows. She is really just concerned with her own personal story, which is her own personal migration story of getting herself back to the United States to be reunited with her mother and her siblings. But that opens the story. But I knew that in order to tell the story of this whole family, I had to go back to the beginning of when the parents, Elena and Mauro, meet. You cannot know where the family is now without knowing who they were and who they were at that moment when really the beginning of the changing of their lives started to occur. And I think that's because that's such a typical point in almost every family who's in the process of migrating their story. Very often you can trace it back to a moment, especially very often when it's a family migrating, it's when the two parents met and when their lives joined and they started to make choices together, and then their choices determine the lives of all their children and change the course of the family history forever. So looking back, there was really no other way for me to tell the story than this way. I had to tell the story of the whole parents meeting and how they came to be together in order to tell the story of the children. I wanted to get into the collective experience that the family was having as a result of the decision to overstay their visas. But I also wanted to get into the private experiences of each family member, which is very different, and really get into the things that they're not even telling each other.
Great. Well, one of our participants says, please talk about the meaning of the title.
So I don't know if you've all read the book. Have you read the book? You've all read the book? Okay, so you know that the title is from a line in the book, obviously near the end. Normally I don't like to spoil it for people who haven't read it. The original title of the book was The Jaguar, the Snake, and the Condor, which is obviously why you see a jaguar, a snake, and a condor on the cover. That was important for me because, in my mind, that's still kind of the title, or it was very important to me to have them represented on the cover. And so I was very happy my publisher did that. But that became very long to see visually on the cover. So at a certain point, I decided I wanted to go for a shorter title, and Infinite Country was from a line in the book. And really, the more that I thought about it, I thought that was really the line that says the most about the whole experience of this family and how they got to be where they are.
Please tell us how you knew the ending could work. It was such a lovely surprise and completely believable.
Well, again, it's experimenting. Usually I only have an idea of the emotional note that I want to end the book on. I wanted to write an ending that felt true, that was true, that was, I know it's believable because I know people who've had this very experience, but it's also a temporal experience because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow for this family. You don't know if they're going to be in that same happy space or if life is going to change drastically, as you know it could, given their circumstances, the next day. So I wanted to provide them with that moment in which it's kind of a suspended moment and you get to see, well, you know, this is sort of what they've all been waiting for, but at the same time offer the sense that you don't know how long it will last. Because when people in mixed status families, or when their existence is pulled into question constantly by laws, there is no certainty.
So as you have mentioned, I mean, you just said, I know people who have had exactly, you know, this type of experience. And although we know that the connections between book and author are complex, how is Infinite Country related to you, right? To your own personal story?
Well, you know, so you mentioned this is my fourth book, and you mentioned that you've read my other books. They're all very different. Yet people ask me the same thing about all my books. People think all my books are autobiographical, so it's like, how many lives could I have possibly had, you know, if all my books are autobiographical? So the fact is, I'm a writer, and I'm a writer of fiction. So anything that ends up on the page has gone through a process of art and imagining. But of course, I'm a person in the world, right? I have my life and the people that I know and I care about. So very often I draw from those things to explore in my work, but I also give myself permission to turn it into something else. So I know a lot of people are curious about, you know, how much of a writer's life shows up in their work. But at the same time, I have a life and it's mine, you know, and the reason why I write books is because I like to write things that are different from my life and explore different terrain. So every book is really an exploration and is asking questions that I don't always have the answer for. But what I try to do is create characters that I find interesting and that I hope readers find interesting. And that's really why I started writing in the first place, was to create worlds and people that I would want to get to know, that I would want to be friends with, and people that I care about.
Great. Here I read, you have the unique capacity to make us hear the characters. How do you hear them?
Well, you know, I spend, like, as I mentioned, I spend a long time daydreaming, you know, about a book before I write it. And it's almost like being able to see it like a film in your mind and hear it like a film. And I can't explain how it got to be this, other than I was a big daydreamer as a kid, and I'm really good at it, at daydreaming, by which I mean that I used to daydream in class and school and get in trouble for it all the time. But a lot of this is very active, productive work in terms of writing, right? Because it allows me to just free my mind and go into those spaces where I'm hearing the things that characters will say to each other. I'm seeing them, you know, speaking with one another in a scene. And I'll start taking notes, writing it into my notebook. And all that, when it comes time to writing the first draft or the second draft, all shows up in there. But then, of course, part of writing is going through editing and revising, and then you just try to polish things up to make things feel even more true and more essential.
The other relationship that is complex is the relationship between the work, the artwork, the book, the painting, whatever it is that we're talking about, and its historical context, right?
Mhm.
And one of the tricky parts we face as readers is not just, as I said before, trying to make the connections between the story and the author, but also um, the story and the events that are happening. And of course, Infinite Country is about migration, the experience of migration. And it is not just an experience that has happened forever and will continue to happen, but that is particularly um, relevant, painful, difficult for citizens nowadays, but particularly for us here in the United States. So could you talk to us about how do you see Infinite Country relevant in that sense, or how do you see it dialoguing with this historical moment?
Um, well, thank you. I agree completely with everything that you're saying. Some people say that this is a timely story, but at the same time, as I'm sure you know, Monica, this is a very old story. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to set the story over a period of so many years, over 20 or so years, beginning in the late 1990s, to really show how how the perception of foreigners in the United States has radically shifted over the past 20 years as a result of the events of 9/11, and how the perception of foreigners was manipulated, for public and media purposes. And a lot of people who suffered as a result of that were Latin American immigrants, which we see now. We're in the long after effects period of the changes that happened then. So you get to see Lynn and Mauro experiencing that in real time, right? They arrive in the 1990s at the turn of the millennium, and things change very quickly in the United States. I'm old enough to remember all that. I'm also the daughter of Colombian immigrants. So I grew up with all this awareness of that rupture in the family tree that happens when a family members depart a homeland and begin a life in another, and how life changes really forever, and you're changing your family history forever. I was born and raised in the United States, even though I'm a dual citizen. And as a result of my parents' decision to stay in the United States, I'm different from my cousins who did not immigrate, you know? And that is forever changed, right? And that's a big burden for a lot of people. It's a big responsibility, and it's often full of doubt and regret and pain and longing and homesickness and a profound sense of loss. And sometimes it doesn't go away. You just adapt. So I really wanted to write a book that spoke to the interior experience of the process of emigrating. A lot of times people focus only on the external, the actions. Oh, you left, you're here, and you're doing things, right? And making a life. And that's all true. But there's a very rich and deep and complex inner life that goes along with that experience. And it can vary widely, even within the same family, which are things that I saw in my own family. My father really, when he left, he was very committed to making a life in the United States. My mother left her entire family, her parents, and she was deeply homesick, and she wanted to go back for a very long time. So this kind of conflicted nature is so common and so typical. And the story of this family in Infinite Country is such a common one as well. I did not have to reach far to invent this. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of families in the exact same circumstances. So all of my books have explored immigration and diaspora in different ways. My first 3 books were narrated by first-person narrators, really focusing on their own individual experience. But what I wanted to write with this book was a family experience and all the twists and turns involved in that. the silences, the grievances, the doubts, and show that in a way that felt true to what I know to be the reality of families who've undergone that experience.
We have another question here. How do actual conditions of existential insecurities beyond the control of your characters provide structure and stress for action and decision points in your stories?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
How do actual conditions of existential insecurities beyond the control of your characters provide structure and stress for action and decision points in your stories?
Okay. Well, when you meet Elena and Mauro in the late 1990s, which was, a particularly violent time in Colombia's history, but they live in the city. They're in Bogota. They're not in the campo or in the mountains or in the jungle where a lot more violence is occurring. But they are part of a country that is touched by violence in different ways, right? The tentacles of violence reach all over the place. And sometimes its only effects are in the fact that it creates a lot of economic instability, a lack of opportunity for young people, or just an overall sense of anxiety in society, different things. And sometimes they're very, very subtle, right? So subtle that you don't even know that you're experiencing that kind of low-level trauma, right? Because it's a country that's been traumatized for so long, it's so internalized and so normalized. But this is the environment that Elena and Mauro have grown up in and that they've lived in, that they're accustomed to. And so that sort of big, wide, open, nothing specialness that awaits them of their future that they're well aware of. And for Elena, she's okay with it. She's got, her mother runs their own business out of their home. But for Mauro, there's a lot more stress. He's had it much tougher than her. And this propels him with a need to, seek opportunity elsewhere. So that's provoking action. That's direct action as well, right there. You get to see other existential, as you put it, situations, for example, when they're in Houston. And after they finally get their own apartment and sort of fall into a routine, and Mauro has a job for a moving company, what happens is that there's a raid and they have to take action. They have to leave immediately, or that's what they decide to do. And so things like this threaten their stability many times as they try to get their footing in the United States, and they have to move several times. So they're constantly in a state of reevaluating their choices. Elena is constantly wondering if maybe if it's time to pack it up and go back, even when she has stayed in the country a long time on her own already. It's still something, as Monica, when you leave a place, your life continues there without you, and that sometimes is very tempting for a lot of people, knowing you could always go back. You can always go back, if there's not some, precarious situation there that you don't want to return to, sometimes it beckons. And it's a very difficult choice to remain day after day, especially when the place where you're in is a relatively hostile environment. So that provokes action throughout the story as well.
Do you have a vision of what the most powerful leaders in nations need to do to create conditions for people's security and happiness?
Do I have a vision for what they need to do? Well, I'm not a politician, but I think that once you start honoring basic human rights for all individuals, and lead with compassion rather than with oppression, or using the technique of marginalizing in order to marginalize a person's rights. Well, that's a place to start. And again, to honor the land that we take so for granted, the ways that we exploit natural resources, and we're largely ruining the planet for this these reasons. So I would say also to reconsider our roles as stewards of the earth, and what also reshape our thinking towards all the creatures of the natural world, including the human species.
Thank you, Patricia. Is there, are there some final words that you would like to share with us regarding how are you proposing that we think about migration?
Uh, you know, I don't write with a sort of agenda for what I want a reader to think and feel. People can make up their own minds about a story. But I think that a lot of people, in fact, most people in the United States, have an immigrant past. If their family hasn't migrated in recent memory, or perhaps in this generation, or the one before, there was an ancestor who was the one who departed the ancestral land and arrived to the United States. A lot of people have disassociated from that fact. And so when they see people who are in the process of emigrating now, they feel that they have nothing in common with them. Something that I could not have anticipated when I wrote this book a few years ago was that it would be published during a global pandemic. And it's a global pandemic which has caused our borders to be closed and has caused countries to close their borders to Americans. So right now, Americans can travel to very few places, and that's a new experience. But also, as a result of the pandemic, which we're now in year 2 of it, right? A lot of people have been separated from their loved ones, even in the same city or the same state, for very long periods of time. So I think this is a period when some people who never thought they would have this experience are getting a taste of what it's like to be separated from your loved ones for reasons that are completely out of your control and for an uncertain amount of time, and how painful that can be. And does it make you any less of a family when you can't be together? What do? I think we've all learned in the past year, how do you stay close to one another when you can't be together, when you can't see each other? And that's really the experience of this family in Infinite Country, is how does a family remain a family over 15 years across distance and time and uncertainty? And there's something else that I think that a lot of people don't consider, particularly in the United States, is that the United States is such a vast country. It's enormous, right? But we take for granted the huge distances we can travel within this country. I live in Miami. For me to go to Seattle is the same distance as if I go to Paris or to London, right? It's the equivalent of an ocean between there, and it's not leaving the same country, right? We take it so for granted, the vast distances that we can cross the United States, that people call themselves bicoastal. They can go from the East Coast to West Coast all the time. That's the distance of 12 countries in another continent. So we migrate all the time. It's just that we're not menaced or blocked by borders. And the reason why we move all the time is because it's a natural instinct to the human species. And it's literally how the human species has ensured its survival from the beginning of its creation, by movements, by moving to pursue more resources, to ensure its survival and the survival of its children, its offspring. All animals do it. When we watch animals in documentaries, we're fascinated about how they know how to migrate to find the food and the water, and oh, it's so beautiful. Look how they just know where to go. But when humans do it, we've been so manipulated that we criminalize it. We look down on it. Say, oh, they should just stay where they are. They don't have the right papers and this and that. Meanwhile, the United States is really, I don't want to say a victim of its own double standards. It's more like its own triple and quadruple standards for all of these things. And I would hope that this pandemic has brought people to a time of reflection in some way, and perhaps in reading my book, it'll maybe think about other things. They'll make them think about other things too, in new ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. I would like to see if Linda maybe has some comments for us as we wrap up and finish our conversation. It has been, you were not here at the beginning, but I want you to know how excited everybody was after reading your book and all the different takes on the story people were sharing before you came in. We are really thankful for this novel to come out. We are really appreciative of that. I, as a scholar who teaches literature, I'm fascinated at the fact that I can share this with my students and I can engage them in discussions about this and a lot of critical thinking about these characters, their experiences, and how close they might be to what they go through as well. So I really thank you for that.